In 1898, a simple box of chocolates arrived at a quiet family's home. It was beautifully wrapped, tied with a pink ribbon, signed, "With Love." They smiled. They shared it. Hours later, they were screaming in pain. 2 people died. And the killer? She never touched them. She mailed the murder from 3,000 miles away. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't even know she was about to die. All she did was open a gift, wrapped in pink ribbon, signed with love, delivered by the United States Postal Service. By the time the chocolate melted on her tongue, death had already entered her home. September 14th, 1906, St. Louis, Missouri. The air carried the scent of coal smoke and river dampness as the Mississippi rolled dark and steady beneath a sky bruised with gathering evening. The World's Fair had closed 2 years earlier, but the city still carried its echo, ambition, modernity, electricity humming through streets that had once known only lantern light. At 1724 Locust Street, behind lace curtains drawn against the fading sun, Clara Whittemore stood at her writing desk and stared at a letter she had already read 3 times. It was brief. Too brief. "My circumstances have changed. It would be best for everyone if we no longer correspond. Please understand this is necessary." Signed, Edward. Necessary. The word throbbed in her mind like a pulse. Clara was 32 years old, not young enough to be naive, not old enough to surrender hope. She had met Edward Langley in the spring of 1904 when he came to St. Louis as a machinery consultant for the fair. He was intelligent, articulate, with a voice that made promises sound inevitable. He told her his marriage was strained. He told her he was misunderstood. He told her she was different. And she believed him. For 2 years, she built her future around sentences he whispered in rented rooms and shaded gardens. She imagined herself leaving St. Louis. She imagined a house in Chicago. She imagined respectability restored under a new name. But Edward Langley had never intended to leave his wife. The letter in Clara's trembling hand was not an apology. It was an erasure. Outside, carriage wheels rattled across cobblestone. Somewhere a phonograph played faintly through an open window. Life continued with unbearable normalcy. Inside, something hardened. Obsession rarely announces itself. It forms quietly, like frost creeping along glass. At first it feels like devotion, then like injustice, then like necessity. Clara folded the letter carefully. She placed it back into its envelope. Then she sat down and began to write. "Dearest Edward," she began, her pen steady. She did not plead. She did not accuse. She wrote as though nothing had changed. She would not allow him the satisfaction of knowing he had wounded her. For 3 weeks she wrote him daily. She received no reply. Then she learned the truth. Edward's wife, Margaret Langley, was expecting a child. The news reached Clara through a mutual acquaintance who did not realize the significance of her casual remark. A luncheon conversation, an offhand congratulations. Clara smiled when she heard it. Later that evening, alone in her parlor, she removed the smile from her face as one might remove a glove. The child changed everything. A wife could be abandoned, a marriage could dissolve, but a child rooted a man permanently. Clara understood that if Margaret carried that pregnancy to term, Edward would never return. And so she began to consider solutions. In 1906, St. Louis was a city of pharmacies. Apothecaries lined Market Street selling tonics and powders and tinctures that promised vitality or relief. Regulation was minimal. Trust was assumed. Clara was educated. She read medical pamphlets. She understood that certain substances could induce illness gradually, subtly, without suspicion. She did not think of it as murder. She thought of it as correction. On October 2nd, Clara entered Wainwright's pharmacy wearing a modest gray traveling dress and gloves despite the mild weather. She requested a small quantity of antimony potassium tartrate, commonly called tartar emetic. She explained that she required it for a rat problem in her boarding house cellar. The pharmacist hesitated. She smiled. She mentioned her father had once practiced medicine. The pharmacist wrapped the brown paper and recorded the sale. Clara signed her name without hesitation. Back at her rooms, she unwrapped the paper and studied the fine crystalline powder. In small doses, it produced nausea and weakness. In larger doses, it could damage the heart. But antimony alone would be too obvious, too crude. She needed subtlety. Edward's wife, Margaret Langley, had a fondness for imported teas. Edward had mentioned it once during a winter evening when snow pressed against the windows of Clara's apartment. Margaret believed in refinement. Clara saw opportunity. On October 10th, Clara composed a letter addressed to Mrs. Margaret Langley of Chicago. The script was elegant, unfamiliar. Madam, I recently returned from Europe and brought with me a rare blend of Turkish tea said to soothe expectant mothers and strengthen the constitution. Having heard of your delicate condition through friends, I hope you will accept this small gift. Signed, a well-wisher. Clara bought loose tea from a specialty shop. She blended into it a measured amount of antimony. Not enough to kill immediately. Enough to weaken. Clara sealed the tin carefully and mailed it from a different postal district office. 5 days later, Margaret Langley brewed her first cup. The nausea began that evening. Her physician attributed it to pregnancy complications. Clara waited. Each week, she mailed another small package, another blend, another measured dose. Margaret grew pale, thin. The child's growth faltered. Edward wrote once more, not to Clara, but to friends in St. Louis, describing her wife's mysterious illness. Clara read the letter through a connection who still believed her heartbroken rather than dangerous. She felt not guilt, but vindication. By December, Margaret was bedridden. Physicians debated diagnoses: gastritis, nervous exhaustion, the frailty of pregnancy. No one suspected the tea. Clara's final package arrived December 22nd. Inside, a small tin with a red silk ribbon. A holiday kindness. Margaret brewed it Christmas Eve. Before dawn, her heart began to fail. The child did not survive. Margaret lingered for 3 days, drifting between lucidity and fever. She asked Edward once, faintly, if he thought someone wished her harm. He assured her no. On December 27, 1906, Margaret Langley died. The death certificate listed cardiac collapse due to complications of pregnancy. Chicago mourned quietly. Edward Langley grieved publicly. Clara Whittemore sat alone in her St. Louis apartment and listened to church bells ring across frozen streets. She believed she had cleared the path. But grief transforms men in unpredictable ways. Edward did not return to Clara. Instead, he withdrew. He wrote to no one. He left Chicago that spring and accepted a position in New York. Clara learned of his departure weeks later.
He had not written her once. The revelation struck deeper than rejection. It meant Margaret's death had not restored Clara's future. It had only erased a woman and an unborn child. And now, Edward was gone. The human mind, when cornered by its own actions, seeks justification. Clara told herself she had not meant for Margaret to die. Only to falter, only to delay. But the powder had not measured itself. In the summer of 1907, a Chicago physician reviewing Margaret's case began to question the rapid decline. He had attended lectures on toxicology. He requested preserved tissue samples. Tests revealed traces of antimony. Suspicion moved slowly, like a shadow across a wall. Margaret had received packages. Edward remembered the T. The handwriting on the letter. Authorities traced postal routes. One clerk recalled a woman in gray gloves mailing small tins frequently. Another remembered her precise manner. By autumn, investigators arrived in St. Louis. They knocked politely at 1720.